All right, this is chapter 7, environmental policy. This is not going to be great because it's on my phone, so I'm going to try to do this really quickly. So, the first case study is about youth activists and different ways that youths with lawsuits have tried to change environmental policy in the U.S. This case was about Juliana versus the United States, which was first brought in 2015. And right now in 2023, it is still ongoing. So these are the plaintiffs. You can read that. I think it's important to realize that people are trying to do something about environmental policy. And then right here on page 164, we are going to start talking about Garrett Hardin's Tragedy of the Commons. Garrett Hardin wrote an essay in the 1960s about how unregulated use of a resource can lead to its depletion. And what this means is that if a whole lot of people are using a resource and nobody is managing it, then eventually everyone will try to get the most out of it that they can, and it will get ruined. And so that's called the tragedy of the commons. And commons means those are those resources that are run by everybody. So some examples of commons are rangeland is used for cattle grazing. That's actually what he wrote about. But some other ones are like the oceans. We use that for food. Air and water are commons. The atmosphere and the oceans, again, are other sources of water. Forests can be commons. We use those for lumber. They clean the air, they clean the water, and we use them for recreation. So a lot of people are like, well, what can we do about this? What are some of the solutions? The main solutions that people suggest are regulations such as laws, quotas, and limits, and things like that. But you should know about Elinor Ostrom. She refuted Garrett Hardin's thesis. She's a Nobel Prize winning economist, and she said that there are numerous examples around the world of people who come together and create their own rules and kind of self-govern their resources, and that what he was saying was not necessarily correct. On page 165, we're talking about external costs. External costs are costs that are paid by people who are not profiting from something. So oil and gas companies might come in, do a lot of drilling, make a lot of money, and then leave a whole lot of mess behind that needs to be cleaned up by other people, and that would be like an external cost. Okay. This kind of case study, the science behind the story, is about climate change. This picture is really important. You should look at it and know the figure in the caption and some of the effects of climate change, but we will do a whole unit on this later. Then there's a couple pages that you should skim, and then we get to the area where we are talking about environmental policy. So here we're talking about the first wave of environmental policy, and it happened in the 1860s to about 1900. This was the Manifest Destiny kind of period of westward expansion. The Homestead Act was passed in 1862, the Mineral Lands Act in 1866, the Timber Culture Act in 1873. The Homestead Act basically said that if you went out west and you built a house and started farming some land, over time the government would deed it to you for the work that you had done on it. So a whole lot of people went west to settle the Midwest, and most of that was prairie biome, and now that biome is almost entirely gone. It's been converted to agriculture. The Mineral Lands Act said that they could mine public lands, and this act is still on the books, and it basically says that if you mine public lands, you are not responsible for cleaning up the mess afterwards, which is kind of crazy. The Timber Culture Act was kind of like, let's cut down the forests and utilize this resource. And you have to understand that at the time, people thought that this Western land that existed it seemed infinite, that there was no possible way that we could use all of that land and resources up. And so this wave was more is about conquering nature instead of conserving it. Then we get to the second wave of environmental policy, which started around 1900. And this tried to mitigate, which means fix, the problems of the first wave. And it did this by establishing national parks, wildlife refuges, and forest reserves. The first national park, Yellowstone, was in 1872. But during this period, the second wave, there were a whole lot more national parks established. And then World War One and World War Two hit, so it kind of like pushed the environment to the side for a little while. And then we look at the third wave of environmental policy, which is the modern wave. It's 1960s to the present. And this is where we are trying to address pollution, trying to protect endangered species. And these are the acronym for some of the laws that we will need to know: the Safe Drinking Water Act, Clean Air Act, Endangered Species Act, Clean Water Act, and so on. There's 10 laws and treaties that you will need to know, and we'll talk about those later. You should know this woman. Her name is Rachel Carson, and she wrote a book called Silent Spring that was about DDT, which is a pesticide, and how damaging it was to the environment. And it was kind of a big kickoff to the third wave of environmentalism. This picture down here is also important. It is the Cuyahoga River in Ohio. I actually grew up about 2 miles from there. But after this happened, in the 1950s and 60s, the river was so polluted from boats that leaked oil and gas and things like that, and other forms of pollution, that the river itself kind of caught fire multiple times. Obviously, the water wasn't on fire, but all of the pollution that was inside it. And this is so shocking to people. They were like, how can a river catch fire? That it was kind of also another impetus towards environmental protection. You should know what the EPA is. It is an agency. It stands for Environmental Protection Agency. It was created in 1970 to enforce the laws that were being created around this time. It is important to note that they cannot create laws. They can only enforce the laws that Congress makes. So Congress has to pass the laws in order for the EPA to enforce them. This page has a whole bunch of laws that you should know, or at least look over. We're going to talk about some of them. We're going to talk about the Clean Air Act, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, Endangered Species Act, Clean Water Act, Safe Drinking Water Act, and the CERCLA Superfund Act. So you can glance at those to get an overview. Then there's another couple pages that you can skim, and we get to page 178. And on this one, you should know these three approaches toward environmental policy. The first one is lawsuits. Like everything in the US, you can sue. So you can sue a company, you can sue a state, you can sue the federal government, and they can sue, the federal government can sue companies and things like that. So lawsuits are a way that environmental policy happens a lot of the time. There is command and control policy and economic policy tools. And we're actually going to talk about an economic policy tool on the next page, which is the subsidy. So a subsidy is something like a tax break or a tax credit, or allowing someone to use a resource for free in such a way that it makes the products artificially cheap, because the subsidies are kind of they're subsidizing some of the costs. That's what the word means. Some of the things that the US government currently gives subsidies to are the gasoline and oil industry, which absolutely does not need it, as they are making record profits all the time. We also subsidize corn, wheat, and soy to the farmers. And these are not the healthiest crops. They're not the most useful crops. And a lot of people blame these crops on America's obesity epidemic because they are grown by the farmers preferentially because of the subsidies. And so they are used in a lot of processed foods, and a lot of people think that that's part of the unhealthiness of America. Coal is another subsidy, something that we should not be subsidizing. And then a lot of timber companies use these roads in the national forests that are technically fire roads, which means that they are there so that firefighters can go in to fight forest fire. But the timber companies use them for logging, and then they don't have to create a road, so it's basically like a subsidy for them. Those are all kind of bad, but this last one is actually a good subsidy. We can also subsidize good things. So photovoltaic cells, or PV cells, are what we call solar panels in this class. And a lot of photovoltaic cells are subsidized in a lot of different states. If you put them on your house, that you can get a pretty nice tax break. You should also know what cap and trade means. This is a market term, and its real name is marketable emissions permits. And what this means is that companies are given a certain amount of pollution that they are allowed to do. And so let's say a company is given 10 units of pollution, but they only use 5. That company can then sell or trade the remaining 5 units to another company that might not be as clean, and they can make some money off of that deal. And then the other company doesn't get in trouble for polluting more than was allowed. And that is it for Chapter 7.